Hello everyone, and welcome back to Fear Files. Today, the stories bring us deep into the unforgiving wilds of the Appalachian Trail, a path that holds far more than legendary beauty and quiet isolation. In this episode, we journey through 9 of the most disturbing real encounters to shadow these ancient mountains. From unexplained vanishings and haunting sights along remote stretches to chilling run-ins with figures who linger long after dark. Each narrative comes straight from the experiences of those who dared to walk this line between civilization and wilderness. These accounts have been shaped from first-hand testimonies and years of whispered warning among hikers and locals alike. Details and names have been adjusted out of respect for those involved, but the underlying truth remains impossible to ignore. The trail hides dangers no map can mark, and the echoes of what happened out there follow survivors for a lifetime. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Fear Files for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. So, this happened back in the spring of 2019. I had just quit my corporate job in Atlanta, one of those soul-crushing positions where you spend your days in a gray cubicle answering emails that could have been text messages and attending meetings that could have been emails. I was burned out, exhausted, and desperate for something real, something that reminded me I was actually alive. That is when I decided to hike a section of the Appalachian Trail, specifically the Georgia portion, starting at Springer Mountain. I was not planning to through hike the entire trail or anything that ambitious. I just wanted a few weeks in the wilderness to clear my head and figure out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I'd done plenty of camping before, but nothing quite like this. Solo hiking was new territory for me. And looking back now, I realized just how unprepared I was for what the trail would teach me about trust, instinct, and survival. Now, I had been on the trail for about 5 days when this incident happened. Those first few days were magical in a way I cannot quite describe. The physical exhaustion, the simplicity of just walking and sleeping and eating, the absence of screens and notifications and demands on my attention. It was exactly what I needed. I had met a few other hikers along the way, exchanged trail names and stories at shelters, shared meals and laughs. Everyone seemed friendly enough, and I was starting to feel like maybe I had found my people out here. The trail community was everything I had read about online: supportive, kind, genuine. I let my guard down completely, and that was my first mistake. Now, on the 5th night, I reached Blood Mountain Shelter just as a storm was rolling in. The shelter was already pretty crowded when I arrived. Maybe 8 or 9 other hikers packed into a space meant for about 12 people, maximum. Everyone was damp and tired, trying to string up wet gear and claim sleeping spots before full dark hit. The atmosphere was friendly, but a bit tense, the way it gets when strangers are forced into close quarters. I found a spot near the back corner, rolled out my sleeping pad and bag, and started going through my nightly routine. That is when I noticed him. There was this older guy, maybe in his late 50s or early 60s, with weathered skin and a scraggly gray beard. He was sitting near the shelter entrance, and unlike everyone else who was busy with their own gear and meals, he just seemed to be watching, observing all of us with this calm, steady gaze that made me slightly uncomfortable. But then he smiled at me, this warm, grandfatherly smile, and introduced himself. He said his name was Canyon, which I assumed was his trail name. He had this deep, soothing voice and immediately started offering advice about the trail ahead. He told me about water sources, warned me about a particularly difficult, rocky section coming up, recommended which shelters had the best views. He seemed incredibly knowledgeable and helpful, and I found myself relaxing around him. Several other hikers were chatting with him too, and he seemed to know everyone's names, where they were headed, what their hiking plans were. He was charismatic in a way that made you want to trust him. Now, as the storm hit that evening, the rain was absolutely pounding on the shelter roof. Thunder crashed overhead, and lightning lit up the forest in brief, stark flashes. We were all packed in tight, and the temperature had dropped significantly. Canyon kept the conversation going, telling stories about his previous hikes, making jokes that had people laughing. He pulled out extra food and shared it generously with hikers who were running low on supplies. He even had a small flask of whiskey that he passed around to help everyone warm up. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have met such a kind, experienced hiker on my first solo trip. He made me feel safe. Around 10 o'clock, people started settling in for the night. The storm was not letting up, and the darkness outside the shelter was absolute. No moon, no stars. Just the occasional flash of lightning revealing the sheets of rain. I crawled into my sleeping bag fully clothed, using my pack as a pillow like I had been doing all week. Canyon was in his bag near the entrance, and I remember him saying goodnight to everyone in that warm voice of his. Within an hour, most people were asleep, the shelter filled with the sounds of snoring and the steady drum of rain. I'm not sure what woke me up. Maybe some subconscious instinct, some ancient part of my brain that sensed danger even while I slept. But I opened my eyes in the pitch darkness and immediately knew something was wrong. My night vision adjusted slowly, and that is when I saw him. Canyon was crouched right next to my sleeping bag, maybe 2 feet from my face. He had my pack open and was rifling through it with slow, deliberate movements. And in his other hand, illuminated by a brief flash of lightning, I saw the knife. My heart stopped. I felt it actually skip several beats as pure terror flooded my system. The knife was not huge, maybe a 4-inch blade, but it was out and in his hand, and he was hovering over me in the dark. For a frozen moment, I could not move, could not breathe, could not think. Then our eyes met. He knew I was awake, and instead of backing away or showing any sign of shame or surprise, he just kept that same calm expression on his face. That is when I knew this man was genuinely dangerous. I sat up fast, my voice coming out louder than I intended, asking him what the hell he was doing. The movement and my voice woke several other hikers immediately. People started stirring, turning on headlamps, asking what was going on. Canyon slowly stood up, still holding my pack and that knife, and his entire demeanor changed. The warm grandfather persona vanished instantly, replaced by something cold and calculating. He said in this flat, emotionless voice that he was protecting me, that he had seen someone else trying to get into my pack, and he was keeping watch, that I should be grateful he was looking out for me. But I could see my pack in his hands. I could see items from it stuffed into his jacket pockets. And other hikers were starting to notice things too. A woman near the front said her headlamp was missing. Another guy realized his wallet was gone from his pack. Within minutes, we discovered that Canyon had been systematically robbing multiple people while we slept. The helpful, generous trail angel was actually a thief who had been working his way through shelters, gaining people's trust and stealing from them in the night. When we confronted him with the evidence, when we found items from different people's packs hidden in his sleeping bag, his expression twisted into something ugly. He started yelling about how we were all stupid weekend warriors who did not deserve to be on the trail, how he had been hiking for 30 years and we owed him, how he took what he wanted because he had earned it. The knife was still in his hand, and several of us backed away instinctively. One of the other hikers, a big guy named Marcus, tried to calm Canyon down, but that just made him angrier. He lunged toward Marcus with the knife, and that is when everything erupted into chaos. People were shouting, trying to stay away from the blade while also trying to keep Canyon from leaving the shelter. In the confusion, I remembered the emergency beacon I had clipped to my pack. My parents had insisted I bring it, one of those satellite GPS devices that can send an SOS to rescue services even without cell coverage. I fumbled for it in the dark, my hand shaking so badly I could barely press the button. but I got it activated. Canyon realized what I had done and his face went pale. He started screaming that we had no right, that we were going to ruin everything. And that is when he said something that made my blood run cold. He said the Rangers knew him, that they had been looking for him, that we just made a huge mistake. It was an admission that he was wanted for something, that whatever he had been doing went far beyond petty theft. Two of the bigger hikers managed to tackle Canyon and wrestle the knife away from him. We tied him up using paracord from someone's pack, and then we just waited. It felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes before we heard voices outside and saw the beams of flashlights cutting through the rain. The Rangers had hiked up from the nearest access point, responding to my emergency beacon. When they saw Canyon tied up, recognition flashed across their faces immediately. They knew exactly who he was. That is when we learned the truth. Canyon was not just a thief. He had been on the trail for months, targeting solo female hikers specifically. There were multiple reports of harassment, assault, and stalking. One woman had barely escaped an attempted attack 3 weeks earlier. The Rangers had been trying to track him, but he kept moving, changing his appearance slightly, using different names. My emergency beacon had finally given them his exact location. They arrested him right there in the shelter. As they led him away into the storm, he looked back at me with this expression of pure hatred. He told me I had ruined his life, that I would regret this. The Rangers assured me I had done the right thing, that I had potentially saved lives. They took statements from all of us, documented everything that had been stolen, and told us we might need to testify if the case went to trial. I did not sleep the rest of that night. None of us did. We sat together in the shelter as the storm finally passed, sharing stories, trying to process what had just happened. The woman whose headlamp was stolen started crying, saying she had felt something was off about Canyon but had ignored her instincts because everyone else seemed to trust him. We all felt violated in different ways. The safe, supportive trail community we thought we were part of had been invaded by a predator who knew exactly how to exploit our trust. I hiked out the next morning with Marcus and 2 other people. None of us wanted to be alone anymore. We stuck together for the next week, and honestly, their company probably saved my hike. I thought about quitting, about going home, about how naive I had been to think the wilderness was somehow safer than the city I had left behind. But I also thought about how my quick thinking with that emergency beacon had stopped Canyon, how my voice, waking the shelter, had prevented whatever he was planning to do to me or someone else. I finished my section hike 3 weeks later, and yes, I am still hiking. I'm more careful now, more aware, less willing to assume everyone with a friendly smile has good intentions. But I also learned something valuable that night in Blood Mountain Shelter. I learned to trust my instincts, to speak up when something feels wrong, to not dismiss that uncomfortable feeling in my gut just because everyone else seems fine with the situation. So I'm thankful that I woke up when I did. I am thankful I was not alone that night. I am thankful for the emergency beacon my parents insisted I carry. And I am thankful that my instincts, even in my sleep, were strong enough to wake me before Canyon could do whatever he had planned. The trail is still beautiful, still transformative, still worth walking, but now I walk it with my eyes wide open. So, this happened in October of 2021. I had been planning this hiking trip for months, and I was not going alone. My hiking partner was this guy I had met through an outdoor adventure group about 2 years prior. His name was Talon, though that was not his real name. We had done dozens of day hikes together, a few overnight camping trips, and he was easily one of the most experienced outdoorsmen I had ever met. The guy could navigate by stars, identify edible plants, build a fire in pouring rain. He was the kind of person you wanted with you in the wilderness. So when we planned a week-long section hike through Shenandoah National Park along the Appalachian Trail, I felt completely confident. If anything went wrong, Talon would know what to do. That confidence ended up being the most dangerous assumption I ever made. Now, We started our hike on a Tuesday morning in mid-October. The fall colors were absolutely spectacular, and the weather was perfect. Cool but not cold, clear skies, just enough breeze to keep the bugs away. We made good time that first day, covering about 12 miles before setting up camp near a shelter. That night, we sat around our small camp stove, eating dehydrated meals and talking about our plans for the next few days. Talon was in an unusually good mood, cracking jokes, telling stories about some of his crazier hiking adventures. He mentioned wanting to explore some of the side trails, maybe find some of the less traveled areas that most hikers skip. I was game for whatever. I trusted him completely. The next morning, we were breaking camp when this older local guy came walking up the trail. He was not dressed like a hiker, just wearing regular clothes and carrying a walking stick. He stopped to chat with us, asked where we were headed, the usual trail small talk. Then he mentioned this shortcut. He said if we took a particular unmarked path about 3 miles ahead near Skyland, we could cut off a significant portion of the trail and save ourselves maybe 4 or 5 miles. He described it as an old fire road that had been mostly reclaimed by the forest, but still passable if you knew where to look. He even drew us a little map on a piece of paper marking the spot where we should leave the main trail. Now, I remember feeling hesitant about it. The whole point of hiking the Appalachian Trail is to hike the actual trail, you know. But Talon was intrigued. He studied the map, asked the guy a bunch of questions about landmarks and terrain. The local seemed knowledgeable enough, mentioned he had lived in the area his whole life and used to hunt in those woods. Talon decided it would be an adventure, a chance to see a part of the park that most people miss. And honestly, the idea of shaving off a few miles did sound appealing. My feet were already starting to develop some hot spots, so I agreed, and we thanked the local for the tip and continued on our way. We reached the spot the locale had marked around noon. At first, I could not see any path at all, just thick forest and undergrowth. But Talon insisted he could see where the old fire road used to be. A slight depression in the ground, trees that were younger and thinner, indicating where the road had once been cleared. We pushed into the forest off the main trail, and within about 50 feet, we did find what looked like it could have been a path at some point, overgrown and barely visible, but there. Talon took the lead, using his hiking poles to push aside branches and test the ground ahead. I followed close behind, keeping my eyes on his bright blue backpack so I would not lose sight of him in the dense foliage. For the first hour or so, things seemed fine. The path, such as it was, continued in roughly the direction we expected. We were heading downhill, which made sense if we were cutting across to rejoin the trail lower down. But gradually, I started noticing that the forest seemed to be getting thicker, darker. The canopy overhead was so dense that barely any sunlight was making it through, and the path we were following kept getting harder to see. Several times, Talon had to stop and look around, trying to figure out which way to go, but he seemed confident. So I stayed quiet and kept following. Around 2 o'clock, Talon decided he wanted to scout ahead. The path had become so faint that we were not even sure we were still on it, and he wanted to climb up to a ridge about a quarter mile ahead to get a better view, maybe figure out where we were in relation to the main trail. He told me to wait right where I was, that he would be back in 20 minutes, 30 at most. He moved fast when he was alone, and it made more sense than both of us bushwhacking up a steep slope, so I agreed. I sat down on a fallen log, pulled out my water bottle and a granola bar, and watched him disappear into the trees. 20 minutes passed, then 30, then 45. I was not worried at first. Talon was probably just having a hard time finding a good vantage point, or maybe the terrain was trickier than it looked. But after an hour, I started calling his name. No response. After an hour and a half, I was yelling at the top of my lungs. Nothing. The forest seemed to swallow my voice completely. Even though I was shouting as loud as I could, it felt like the sound was not traveling more than a few feet. It was the strangest sensation, like the trees were absorbing everything. By 3:30, I was starting to panic. I tried to retrace our steps back to the main trail, but everything looked the same. Every tree, every rock formation, every slight rise and depression in the ground. I had been so focused on following Talon that I had not paid attention to any landmarks. I pulled out my phone to check my GPS, but I had no signal. I had downloaded offline maps, but they only showed the main trail, not whatever unmapped area we had wandered into. I tried to stay calm, tried to remember all the survival advice I had read. Stay put, conserve energy, someone will find you. But Talon was out there somewhere, possibly hurt, possibly lost himself. I could not just sit and do nothing. I spent the next 4 hours searching for him. I climbed up to what I thought was the ridge he had mentioned, but I could not find any sign of him. I called his name until my throat was raw. I blew my emergency whistle until my lungs ached. Nothing. As the sun started to set, the forest took on this oppressive quality. The shadows grew long and strange. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no rustling leaves. Just this heavy, suffocating quiet that made me feel like I was the only living thing in the entire forest. I made the decision to try to find my way back to the main trail. Staying put was not an option anymore. If I could get back to the Appalachian Trail, I could get help for both of us. I picked a direction that felt right and started walking. But the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. The terrain made no sense. I would climb uphill for what felt like miles, only to suddenly find myself going downhill again. The trees seemed to shift and rearrange themselves. Several times I walked past formations that I swear I had seen before, but coming from a different direction. It was like the forest was deliberately confusing me, leading me in circles. As darkness fell completely, I had to stop. I could not risk injuring myself stumbling around in the dark. I found a relatively clear spot against a large boulder, pulled on every layer of clothing I had, and tried to make myself as small and warm as possible. I did not sleep. I could not. Every sound, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves sent adrenaline spiking through my system. But more than that, I kept thinking about Talon. Where was he? Was he hurt? Was he looking for me the same way I had been looking for him? Or had something worse happened? The night was the longest of my entire life, and when dawn finally came, I was exhausted, dehydrated, and terrified. But I kept moving. I had to. I picked another direction and just walked. Around 10 in the morning, I stumbled across a stream. I followed it downstream, reasoning that water flows downhill and eventually reaches civilization. And after another 3 hours of walking, following that stream through increasingly rough terrain, I finally saw it. A white blaze on a tree, the Appalachian Trail. I actually collapsed when I saw it, just dropped to my knees and started crying. I hiked north to the nearest shelter, where I found other hikers. They gave me food and water, while I used their satellite phone to call for help. Within 2 hours, search and rescue teams were being mobilized. I gave them every detail I could remember about where we had left the trail, about the direction Talon had gone when he left to scout ahead. They organized one of the largest search operations Shenandoah had seen in years. Dogs, helicopters, thermal imaging, volunteers. Hundreds of people looking for one missing hiker. They searched for 2 weeks. They covered the entire area where I thought we had been, plus miles beyond in every direction. They found nothing. No trace of Talon, no sign of where he might have gone. It was like he had simply vanished into thin air. Eventually, the search was scaled back to periodic sweeps. His family was devastated. I was devastated. I kept replaying that moment over and over. The last time I saw him, walking away into the trees, his blue backpack disappearing into the shadows. 3 years passed. 3 years of guilt and questions and nightmares about those woods. And then, in October of 2024, 2 hunters found human remains about 15 miles from where we had originally left the trail. Dental records confirmed it was Talon. But here is the thing that nobody can explain. The area where he was found had been searched multiple times during the original search operation. Teams had walked through there with dogs and metal detectors. They found nothing. And yet there he was, his body and gear lying in a relatively open area that should have been easily spotted. There was no evidence of animal scattering, no indication that the remains had been moved there recently. It was like he had been there the whole time, somehow invisible to hundreds of trained searchers. The medical examiner could not determine a cause of death. No signs of trauma, no evidence of exposure or dehydration. His gear was all accounted for, his water bottle still half full. He should not have died. And even if he had suffered some kind of medical emergency, that does not explain how his body ended up so far from where he should have been, or why it was not found during the extensive search. I have tried to make sense of it. I have gone over every possibility, every rational explanation, but none of them fit. That forest changed the day we left the trail. Something in those woods took Talon from me, and I will never understand what or why. I do not hike Shenandoah anymore. I cannot. Just thinking about those trees, that silence, that oppressive sense of wrongness makes my chest tight. So I'm thankful I made it out when I did, because I do not think those woods planned on letting either of us leave. I'm thankful for that stream that led me back to the trail, but I will never stop wondering what happened to Talon in those lost hours. And I will never stop feeling like maybe, somehow, I left him in a place where the normal rules do not apply, where people can disappear into nothing and reappear years later with no explanation. The Appalachian Trail is marked and mapped and hiked by thousands every year, but just off that trail, there are places that do not want to be found. And if you wander into them, you might never find your way back. So this happened in late autumn of 2020, right around the end of November. I was attempting what a lot of people would probably call a foolish hike. I was trying to complete a section of the Appalachian Trail through Maine before the official winter closure. Now, I know that sounds reckless, and looking back, it absolutely was. But at the time, I was going through some personal stuff, and I needed to be alone. I needed to push myself, to prove something to myself. I had hiked plenty of times before, always in good weather, always well prepared. This time I was chasing something different. I wanted the challenge, the isolation, the kind of experience that strips everything away and leaves you with just yourself and the wilderness. Now, the weather had been holding reasonably well for the first 3 days of my hike. Cold, obviously, temperatures dropping into the 20s at night, but clear skies and no precipitation. I was making good time, my gear was solid, and I felt strong. But on the 4th day, the forecast that I had checked before losing cell signal started to prove accurate. Clouds rolled in thick and gray, and by early afternoon the first snowflakes began to fall. Within an hour, it had become a legitimate snowstorm. Heavy, wet snow that clung to everything and reduced visibility to maybe 20 feet. The temperature was dropping fast, and the wind was picking up. I knew I needed to find shelter soon. I had my tent, of course, but setting it up in these conditions would be miserable, and staying warm through the night would be a serious challenge. I was searching for one of the marked shelters along the trail, but the snow was coming down so hard that I was having trouble seeing the trailblazes. I kept my head down, focused on just putting one foot in front of the other, trying not to panic. That is when I saw it through the swirling snow, a structure maybe 50 yards off the trail to my left. At first, I thought it might be one of the trail shelters, but as I got closer, I realized it was a cabin. An actual cabin with 4 walls and a door. Now, I knew there were old hunting cabins scattered throughout this region. Some were maintained, some were abandoned, some were private property with very angry owners. But in a snowstorm, with darkness coming fast, I did not have much choice. I approached cautiously, called out to see if anyone was there, and when I got no response, I tried the door. It was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside and immediately felt relief as the wind and snow stopped battering me. The interior was a single room, maybe 15 by 20 feet. There was a wood stove in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs, a cot against one wall, and some shelves with old canned goods and supplies. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. Clearly, nobody had been here in quite some time. I closed the door behind me and set my pack down, taking in the space more carefully. The cabin had obviously been used as a hunting camp at some point, probably decades ago, based on the condition of things. There were some old tools hanging on the walls, a few dusty blankets folded on the cot, and surprisingly, a decent amount of firewood stacked near the stove. What struck me as odd, though, was that one of the chairs at the table was completely dust-free. The seat, the armrests, everything. Like someone had been sitting there recently. But when I looked around, there were no footprints in the dust on the floor except my own. No other signs of recent occupation. I told myself it was just a trick of the light. Or maybe the dust had settled unevenly. I was cold and tired and not thinking clearly. I got to work starting a fire in the wood stove, using some of the old firewood and kindling I found. The cabin warmed up quickly, and I began to relax a bit. I pulled out my camp stove and started heating up some water for a freeze-dried meal. That is when I noticed the journal. It was sitting on the table, right next to the clean chair. A small, leather-bound notebook that definitely had not been there when I first glanced at the table. I know that sounds impossible, but I swear it appeared while I was getting the fire started. My hands were shaking a bit as I picked it up and opened it. The entries were handwritten, dated over the course of several months in 2015. The handwriting started out neat and controlled, but became increasingly erratic as the entries progressed. The first few entries were mundane. Someone had come to the cabin for a hunting trip, talking about deer sightings and the weather, and what they had for dinner. But then the tone shifted. The writer started mentioning feeling watched, seeing shapes moving in the trees outside the windows, hearing footsteps circling the cabin at night. At first, they dismissed it as animals, bears maybe, or deer. But the entries became more paranoid. The writer was convinced that there were people out there, multiple people, standing just beyond the tree line, watching the cabin. The writer could see them during the day, motionless figures among the trees. At night, they would come closer, pressing their faces against the windows. I felt my skin crawling as I read this. The handwriting became harder to read, the sentences fragmenting. The writer talked about barricading the door, about not sleeping, about how the watchers never moved during the day, but at night they would circle the cabin, over and over, their footsteps crunching in the snow. The final entries were almost illegible, rambling about how the watchers were getting bolder, how they had started leaving things outside the door, bones, dead animals, strange symbols drawn in the dirt. And then the last entry, dated in early December of 2015, 3 sentences. I can hear them inside the walls. They are scratching. They are inside now. And that was it. No more entries. I closed the journal and looked around the cabin with fresh eyes. The walls were solid logs, no gaps or spaces where anyone could be hiding. But the idea had been planted in my head, and I could not shake it. I stood up and walked to one of the windows, wiping away some of the grime to look outside. The snow was still falling heavily, and visibility was terrible. But as I stared out into the white and gray, I thought I saw something. A shape. A person-shaped shadow, standing among the trees maybe 30 feet from the cabin. I blinked and looked again. It was still there, completely motionless despite the wind and snow. I backed away from the window and checked the other side of the cabin. Another figure, and another. I counted at least 6 of them, spread out in a rough circle around the cabin, all facing toward me. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. I tried to rationalize it. Trees, I told myself. Just trees that looked like people in the poor visibility. Shadows and snow playing tricks. But then one of them moved. It was subtle, just a slight shift, but it was definitely movement. And once I saw one move, I saw others. Small adjustments, stepping slightly closer, turning their heads. They were real. There were people out there in the storm, surrounding the cabin. I grabbed my phone even though I knew I had no signal. But I thought maybe I could at least use the camera. I tried to take a photo through the window, but my phone died instantly. Battery just dropped to 0 even though it had been at 40% a minute ago. I backed away from the windows and considered my options. I could stay in the cabin, barricade the door like the journal writer had done. Or I could grab my pack and make a run for it. Try to get back to the trail and put distance between myself and whatever was out there. But it was dark now, and the storm had not let up. Running blindly through a Maine forest in a blizzard was probably suicide, so I made the decision to fortify my position. I dragged the table over to the door and wedged it underneath the handle. I moved the cot to block one of the windows. I fed more wood into the stove to keep the fire going strong, and then I sat in the corner farthest from the windows and waited. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps, crunching in the snow outside, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I counted the rhythm. One set of footsteps, then another, multiple people walking around the perimeter of the cabin in the same direction. I did not dare look out the windows. I just sat there with my knife in one hand and my bear spray in the other, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps continued for hours. Sometimes they would stop for a few minutes, and I would hope it was over. Then they would start again. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted but too afraid to sleep. The footsteps had stopped maybe an hour before sunrise. I waited until there was enough light to see clearly, and then I carefully moved to one of the windows and looked out. The snow had stopped, the sky was clearing, and there were no people. No figures among the trees, but the snow around the cabin told a different story. There were dozens of handprints on every window, pressed against the glass at different heights and angles. Some were small, like a child's. Some were large, like a man's. All of them clear and distinct in the frost that had formed on the outside of the windows. But here is what made my blood run cold. There were no footprints in the snow. None. The snow around the cabin was smooth and undisturbed except for where it had been blown into drifts by the wind. No tracks leading to the windows. No evidence that anyone had walked around the cabin. Just those handprints, dozens of them, as if the watchers had floated to the windows without touching the ground. I did not wait to investigate further. I grabbed my pack, shoved the journal inside it, and left that cabin as fast as I could move. I hiked for 6 straight hours without stopping, driven by pure adrenaline and terror. When I finally reached a road and got a ride to the nearest town, I reported what I had found to the local authorities. I gave them the location of the cabin as best I could remember and showed them the journal. They told me the cabin had belonged to a man named Mesa, who had disappeared in December of 2015. He had gone up there for a solo hunting trip and never came back. They had searched the area but never found his body or any sign of what happened to him. The cabin had been checked, they said, and there was nothing suspicious, just an empty hunting camp. They asked if I wanted to file a report about the handprints and the figures I saw. But when I showed them the photos I had tried to take, my phone had no images from that night, just corrupted files that would not open. I kept the journal. I know I probably should not have, but I did. Sometimes I read through it, trying to understand what Mesa experienced, trying to make sense of what I saw. But there is no sense to be made. I do not know if those watchers were real people, some kind of cult or group that lives in those woods. I do not know if they were something else entirely, something that does not follow the rules of the world I understand. All I know is that cabin is still out there, and whatever watches it is still there too. So I am thankful I did not stay to find out if those watchers were real or if that cabin was making me lose my mind like it did to Mesa. I am thankful for the daylight that let me escape, and I am thankful that I will never, ever go back to that section of the Maine wilderness again. Some shelters are not worth the protection they offer. So this happened in the summer of 2018. I was doing a solo section hike through Pennsylvania, specifically the stretch near Duncannon. Now, Pennsylvania has this reputation among Appalachian trail hikers as being kind of brutal, not because of elevation, but because of the rocks. They call it Rocksylvania for good reason. The trail is just endless miles of jagged rocks that tear up your feet and slow your pace to a crawl. But I was determined to complete this section, because once you get through Pennsylvania, you're more than halfway done if you're through hiking. And even as a section hiker, it felt like an important milestone to reach. I had been on the trail for about 4 days at this point, maintaining a pretty steady pace despite the rocky terrain. I was averaging maybe 12 to 15 miles a day, which is not amazing but respectable given the conditions. The weather had been perfect. Clear skies, temperatures in the 70s, just enough breeze to keep things comfortable. I had encountered plenty of other hikers along the way, the usual mix of through hikers and weekenders, and everyone was friendly and upbeat. The trail community was in full swing, and I was feeling good about everything. Now, it was on the morning of the 5th day that I first saw him. I had just left a shelter where I had spent the night, and I was maybe 2 miles down the trail when I came around a bend and saw this elderly hiker sitting on a rock taking a break. He looked to be in his 70s at least, with white hair and a deeply lined face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. But what really caught my attention was his gear. Everything about it was vintage, like seriously old school. He had one of those external frame backpacks from the 70s, the kind made of aluminum tubes and canvas. His boots looked ancient but well maintained. He was wearing wool pants, an actual flannel shirt, and he had a walking stick that was just a carved piece of wood. No modern trekking poles, no high-tech fabrics, nothing. It was like he had stepped out of a time capsule from 40 years ago. He looked up as I approached and gave me this warm, friendly smile. He introduced himself as Dakota and asked how my hike was going. His voice had this gentle quality to it, very calming. We chatted for a few minutes about the trail conditions, the weather, the usual hiker small talk. He seemed incredibly knowledgeable about the area, mentioning landmarks and features that even my detailed guidebook did not cover. He told me about a particularly nice campsite coming up in about 8 miles near a stream with excellent water. He described the spot so vividly that I could picture it clearly. Then he wished me well and said he needed to get moving. I watched him head down the trail ahead of me, moving at a surprisingly good pace for someone his age. Now, I did not think much of it at first. Sure, his gear was outdated, but some people are purists who prefer the old ways. And plenty of older hikers are in better shape than people half their age. I continued on my way, taking my time over the rocky section, stopping for lunch around noon. That afternoon, I reached the campsite that Dakota had told me about, and it was exactly as he had described. A perfect little clearing next to a crystal-clear stream, a fire ring already set up, even a log positioned perfectly for sitting. I set up my tent and was filtering water when I heard a voice behind me. It was Dakota. He had apparently decided to camp at the same spot. But here is the thing that did not make sense. I had not seen him pass me on the trail, and I had not stopped except for lunch, maybe 30 minutes total. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me without me seeing him, especially given the pace I had watched him moving at that morning. The trail through this section was pretty straightforward, no alternate routes or side trails. But there he was, already setting up his camp on the opposite side of the clearing, that same friendly smile on his face. I walked over and asked him if he had passed me somehow without me noticing. He just chuckled and said something about how he knew some shortcuts, old hunter trails that paralleled the AT. He mentioned he had been hiking these mountains since he was a young man and knew them better than the official trail. That made sense, I suppose, though it did strike me as odd that he would bother with shortcuts. Most people hike the AT specifically to hike the actual trail, not to find faster routes around it. But I shrugged it off and went back to setting up my camp. That evening, we sat by the fire together, and he told me stories. He talked about his early hikes in the 70s, before the trail was as developed and popular as it is now. He described shelters that no longer exist, trail towns that have changed completely, encounters with wildlife that sound almost mythical. He was a captivating storyteller, and I found myself completely absorbed in his tales. At one point, I pulled out my phone to take a photo of him by the fire, thinking it would make a great memory of this encounter with an old-timer who represented a different era of hiking. But when I looked at the screen, my phone had died completely, just shut off despite having a 70% charge that afternoon. We talked until well after dark, and then Dakota said he needed to turn in. He stood up, wished me a good night, and walked back to where his camp was set up. Except when I looked over a few minutes later, I could not see a tent. I could not see any gear at all, just the dark forest. I told myself he must have set up farther back in the trees than I had realized, out of sight from the clearing. But it nagged at me as I crawled into my own tent and tried to sleep. The next morning, I woke up early and looked over to where Dakota had been camping. There was nothing there. No tent, no sleeping bag, no sign that anyone had camped there at all. The ground was undisturbed, still covered in pine needles and leaves. I walked over to investigate, thinking maybe I had the location wrong. But no, this was definitely where I had seen him set up. I could see my own campsite across the clearing, could see where I had been sitting by the fire the night before, but there was absolutely no evidence that Dakota had been there. I packed up quickly, feeling increasingly unsettled. I told myself he must have gotten up super early and moved on, though that did not explain the lack of any sign he had camped there. I hit the trail at first light, moving faster than I had been, wanting to put some distance behind me and hopefully run into other hikers who might ground me in reality. Around mid-morning, I reached another shelter. There were 3 hikers there taking a break, and I gratefully joined them, happy to see other people. We got to talking, and I mentioned seeing an older hiker with vintage gear, described Dakota to them, asked if they had seen him on the trail. All 3 of them gave me strange looks. One of them, a through hiker who had been on the trail for months, said there were not many older hikers in this section right now, and he definitely had not seen anyone matching that description. He joked that maybe I had seen a ghost, and we all laughed. But the joke sat uncomfortably in my stomach. I kept hiking, and that afternoon, I encountered Dakota for a 3rd time. This time he was sitting at a trail junction, and as I approached, he stood up and stopped me. His expression was serious, more intense than I had seen before. He pointed down one of the trails and told me I needed to listen carefully. He said there was a dangerous section coming up near an old abandoned quarry. He said the trail got very close to the edge and that erosion had made it unstable. He told me to stay to the left side of the trail to watch my footing and to not get distracted by the views. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said, "That is where I died. Do not make the same mistake I did." Before I could respond, before I could even process what he had just said, he turned and walked away into the forest. Not down the trail, just straight into the trees. I started to follow him, to call out, but when I reached the spot where he had entered the woods, there was nothing. No broken branches, no footprints, no sign of passage, just dense forest that looked like it had not been disturbed in years. I stood there for a long time, my mind racing. What he said, the way he disappeared, the fact that there was never any evidence of him camping. I pulled out my guidebook with shaking hands and started reading about the area ahead. And there it was, a note about an old quarry near the trail, warnings about staying on the marked path. And then, in smaller text, a mention of a hiker named Dakota Vale, who had died in 1977 after falling into the quarry while hiking alone. I hiked the next section very, very carefully. When I reached the area near the quarry, I understood immediately what Dakota had warned me about. The trail did run close to the edge, and you could see where erosion had eaten away at the path. If you were not paying attention, if you were looking out at the view instead of watching your feet, it would be easy to step too close to the crumbling edge. Easy to fall. I stayed far to the left, just like Dakota had told me, and I made it through safely. At the next trail town, I asked about Dakota Vale at the local outfitter shop. The owner, an older guy who had lived in the area his whole life, knew the story immediately. He said Dakota had been an experienced hiker, knew the trails better than anyone. But one day in the summer of 1977, he had gone out alone and never came back. They found his body at the bottom of the quarry 3 days later. The owner said there was a small memorial plaque somewhere near the site, though he was not sure if it was still there after all these years. He also said, and this part gave me chills, that hikers occasionally reported seeing an older man in vintage gear on that section of trail. Always friendly, always helpful, always warning people about the dangerous areas. I never saw Dakota again after that third encounter, but I did find the memorial plaque. It was small, weathered, almost hidden by vegetation growing around it. Dakota Vale, 1925 to 1977. It read, "A dedicated hiker who loved these mountains." I stood there for a while, looking at that plaque, thinking about the 3 times I had met him, thinking about how he had known exactly where the dangerous section was, because that was where he had died. Thinking about how he had appeared ahead of me at that perfect campsite, and at the trail junction, always seeming to be in the right place at the right time to offer help. So I'm thankful that Dakota is still out there, keeping hikers safe from the mistake that took his life. I am thankful he warned me about that quarry edge, and I am thankful that even death could not keep him from the mountains he loved enough to never leave. Some hikers finish their journey and go home. Others, like Dakota, decide to stay on the trail forever. And if you ever meet an elderly hiker in Pennsylvania with vintage gear and a kind smile, listen to what he tells you. He might just save your life. So this happened in June of 2022. I was hiking the section of the Appalachian Trail that runs along the North Carolina and Tennessee border, specifically near Roan Mountain. This is one of the most beautiful stretches of the entire trail, with these incredible high-elevation balds that give you 360-degree views of the surrounding mountains. The rhododendron blooms were just starting to come in, and I had planned my trip specifically to catch them at their peak. I had done plenty of research about this section, read all the guidebooks, talked to other hikers who had been through there. Everyone said it was spectacular, challenging but manageable, and generally a really positive experience. Nobody mentioned what I would encounter that night. Now, I should mention that I am not typically a night hiker. I prefer to get to my campsite or shelter well before dark, set up, cook dinner, and have everything squared away before the sun goes down. But on this particular day, I'd gotten a late start due to some gear issues back at the hostel where I had stayed the night before. One of my trekking pole tips had broken off, and I had to wait for the outfitter to open so I could replace it. By the time I got back on the trail, it was almost noon. I knew I could make it to my planned shelter before full dark if I pushed hard, but it was going to be close. I made good time through the afternoon, moving faster than I normally would because I was trying to beat the sunset. The terrain was challenging but manageable, lots of ups and downs, some rocky sections, but nothing too technical. The weather was perfect. Clear blue sky, temperature in the low 70s, just enough breeze to keep me cool while I was working hard. I passed a few other hikers heading the opposite direction, exchanged the usual greetings and trail updates. Everyone seemed to be in good spirits. It was shaping up to be a great day, despite the late start. Around 7 in the evening, the sun was getting low, but I was close to my destination. According to my map, I had maybe another 2 miles to go before I reached the shelter. The trail at this point was following a ridgeline through fairly dense forest. The trees were thick on both sides, mostly hardwoods, with an understory of rhododendron and mountain laurel. Visibility into the woods was limited to maybe 20 or 30 feet before everything disappeared into green shadow. I had my headlamp ready in my pack, but I was hoping I would not need it. There is something unnerving about hiking in the dark, even on a well-marked trail. Your world shrinks down to just the circle of light from your headlamp, and every sound seems amplified and threatening. That is when I heard the first scream. It came from somewhere off to my left, maybe 100 yards into the forest. At first, my brain tried to categorize it as an animal sound. Maybe a fox, I thought. Foxes can make these horrifying screaming sounds that people often mistake for a woman in distress. Or maybe a bobcat or a mountain lion, though mountain lions are supposedly not in this area. But even as I was trying to rationalize it, I knew it was not an animal sound. It was too articulated, too full of what I can only describe as rage and pain. It was a scream that made every hair on my body stand up, that triggered some ancient prey response deep in my hindbrain. I stopped walking and stood completely still, listening. The forest had gone silent. The birds that had been singing moments before had stopped. Even the insects seemed to have shut up. Just total, oppressive silence. I waited for maybe 2 minutes, my heart pounding, debating whether to turn around and hike back to the last shelter I had passed, which was about 5 miles behind me. But that would mean hiking in the dark anyway, and I would be even farther from help if I needed it. So I decided to keep moving forward, but faster. I started power hiking, my eyes constantly scanning the forest on both sides of the trail. The second scream came maybe 10 minutes later. This time it was closer, and it was on my right side. Same horrible, not quite human quality. Like someone trying to scream through a throat that was not built for human speech. I felt my stomach drop. The scream had come from a different direction, which meant either there were multiple sources of the sound, or whatever was making it had moved position incredibly fast. The forest was too thick for me to have seen anything moving parallel to my position, but I would have heard it crashing through the undergrowth. Except I had not heard anything. Just that scream. And then silence again. I picked up my pace even more, practically jogging along the trail. My rational mind was still trying to find explanations. Maybe it was other hikers playing a prank. Maybe it was some kind of bird I was not familiar with. Maybe it was just the wind moving through rock formations in a weird way. But none of those explanations felt right. My instincts were screaming at me that I was in danger, that I needed to get to the shelter or at least to an open area where I could see what was around me. The third scream made me freeze in my tracks. This time, it was directly ahead of me on the trail, maybe 50 feet away, but I could not see anything. The trail curved slightly and disappeared into shadow, and whatever had made that sound was just out of sight around the bend. For a long moment, I considered leaving the trail entirely, bushwhacking through the forest to try to get around whatever was ahead. But that was probably even more dangerous. At least on the trail, I knew where I was going. Off trail in this dense forest, I could easily get lost, especially with darkness coming on fast. I forced myself to keep moving forward, every sense on high alert. As I came around the bend in the trail, I saw nothing. No animal, no person, no explanation for the scream. Just empty trail stretching ahead of me. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I could feel eyes on me from the forest, tracking my movement. I started talking out loud, partly to make noise and partly to keep myself from panicking. I was saying stupid things like, "I am just passing through," and "I do not want any trouble," as if whatever was out there would understand or care. That is when the screaming started in earnest. Not just one or two isolated screams, but a chorus of them, coming from multiple directions all around me. Ahead, behind, both sides. The sounds were moving, circling my position. And they were getting closer. Through the dimming light and the thick vegetation, I started to catch glimpses of movement. Something large, moving through the trees on 2 legs, not 4. 2. Walking upright like a person, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too broad in the shoulders, moving in a way that was almost human, but not quite. I broke into a run. I do not care what any wilderness safety guide says about not running from predators. Every fiber of my being was telling me to get away from those things as fast as possible. My pack was bouncing painfully on my back. My lungs were burning, but I ran harder than I have ever run in my life. The screaming followed me, seeming to pace my speed. And then I heard something even more terrifying. Footsteps. Heavy, pounding footsteps crashing through the undergrowth, parallel to the trail. Something was running with me, keeping pace, staying just out of sight in the trees. I do not know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning. But eventually, I saw light ahead. Not sunset light, but the artificial glow of a headlamp or lantern. The shelter. There were other hikers there. I practically stumbled into the clearing around the shelter, gasping for air, my legs shaking. There were 4 other hikers at the shelter, and they all jumped up in alarm when they saw me burst out of the forest. Before I could even speak, before I could explain what had happened, one of the hikers held up a hand and said, "We heard it too." All 4 of them looked terrified. They said the screaming had started maybe 20 minutes ago, and it seemed to be getting closer to the shelter. They had been debating whether to pack up and try to hike out in the dark, but they were too scared to leave the relative safety of the shelter structure. We all stood there listening as the screams continued to echo through the forest around us. They were close now, maybe within 100 feet of the shelter clearing. One of the hikers, a woman named Sienna, who had been on the trail for over a month, said she had never heard anything like it. She had encountered bears, had heard coyotes and foxes and every other kind of wildlife, but this was different. This was something else. We decided to fortify our position. We pulled all our food bags inside the shelter instead of hanging them, not wanting to go out into the dark. We gathered up some large rocks and sticks. Pathetic weapons, but better than nothing. And then we waited. Around 9 o'clock, the screaming stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise had been. We sat there in the dark, our headlamps turned off so we would not make ourselves visible, just listening. That is when I heard it. Footsteps. Multiple sets of footsteps moving around the perimeter of the clearing. Slow, deliberate, almost stalking. Through the darkness, I caught glimpses of shapes. Massive shapes, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, moving between the trees just beyond the edge of the clearing. Sienna grabbed my arm so hard it hurt and pointed to the edge of the clearing. In the faint moonlight that was filtering through the canopy, I could see them more clearly now. There were at least 3 of them, possibly more. Bipedal, covered in dark hair or fur, with eyes that reflected our headlamp beams when they caught the light just right. They were not approaching the shelter directly, but they were definitely watching us circling, testing our defenses maybe. We stayed awake all night. Nobody even suggested trying to sleep. We took turns keeping watch, though honestly, all of us were watching constantly. The creatures, whatever they were, stayed out there until just before dawn. The last thing I heard before the sun came up was one final scream, farther away this time, almost like a departing signal. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we cautiously ventured out of the shelter to look around. What we found made my blood run cold. In the mud near the shelter, there were handprints. Not paw prints, handprints. But they were massive, easily twice the size of a human hand, with elongated fingers and what looked like claw marks at the tips. There were also disturbances in the undergrowth, where something had pushed through, broken branches, bent saplings, and on several trees at the edge of the clearing, the bark had been stripped away in long, vertical gouges, starting at about 9 feet off the ground and going down to about 7 feet. The marks were fresh, the exposed wood still pale and oozing sap. We documented everything with our phones, taking photos and videos. Then we packed up and hiked out together as a group, nobody willing to be alone after what we had experienced. We reported it to the rangers at the next station we came to. They listened politely, took our report, examined our photos. They said they would look into it, but I could tell they thought we were exaggerating or misinterpreting what we had seen. They suggested it might have been bears, despite the fact that the handprints clearly had 5 fingers and an opposable thumb. I researched it later, after I got off the trail. The area around Roan Mountain has a history of strange sightings going back decades. Locals have names for the creatures that supposedly live in those mountains. Some call them wood apes. Others use different names I will not repeat. There are stories from the Cherokee about beings that live in the high country, that scream to mark their territory and chase away intruders. I do not know what we encountered that night. I cannot prove it was anything beyond misidentified wildlife and overactive imaginations fueled by fear and darkness. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Those were not bears making those sounds. Those were not human hands that left prints in the mud. And the way those things moved, the intelligence in how they circled our position and tested our defenses, that was not animal behavior. That was something else. Something old. Something that has lived in those mountains long before we ever thought to walk through them on our recreational hiking trails. So I am thankful I was not alone when whatever that thing was decided to announce its presence. I am thankful for Sienna and the other hikers who kept watch with me through that endless night. I am thankful we all made it to morning, and I am thankful that when those creatures finally left at dawn, they left us alive to tell the story. Some people say I should go back, try to find more evidence, prove what is out there. But I know better. Those mountains have secrets they have kept for thousands of years, and some secrets, I think, are meant to stay in the dark where they belong. So this happened in the fall of 2017. I was section hiking through Vermont, which is honestly one of my favorite parts of the entire Appalachian Trail. The Green Mountains are absolutely gorgeous in autumn, and I had timed my trip specifically to catch peak foliage. The weather was perfect, the colors were spectacular, and for the first few days, everything went exactly according to plan. I was averaging about 15 miles a day, stopping at shelters most nights, occasionally stealth camping when I wanted some extra solitude. The trail community was friendly, but not overwhelming, just the right balance of social interaction and peaceful hiking. I had no reason to think anything was going to go wrong. Now, it was on the 4th day that I started noticing the symbols. At first, I thought maybe I was just seeing things, or maybe it was just natural wear and tear on the trail markers. But the more I paid attention, the more obvious it became. Beneath some of the standard white blazes that mark the Appalachian Trail, there were additional markings. They were painted in what looked like the same white paint, but the symbols were definitely not official trail markers. They were strange geometric shapes, almost runic in appearance. Circles with lines through them, triangles with dots at their points, other designs that did not correspond to any trail marking system I had ever seen. I pulled out my guidebook to see if there was any mention of alternative marking systems in this section, maybe something to do with side trails or historical routes. But there was nothing. The guidebook made no mention of any additional symbols. I took photos of a few of them with my phone, thinking maybe I would research it later, or ask other hikers if they had seen the same thing. But honestly, I was not too concerned at that point. Vandalism happens on the trail sometimes. People carve initials into trees, spray paint rocks, all sorts of stupid stuff that violates leave no trace principles. I figured it was just some hiker with too much time and paint on their hands. But then I reached the shelter where I'd planned to spend that night, and that is when things got genuinely weird. The shelter itself was standard, just a 3-sided wooden structure with a sleeping platform, the usual setup. But all around the shelter, maybe 15 or 20 feet out in a rough circle, there were offerings. That is the only word I can use to describe them. Arrangements of objects that were clearly intentional, clearly placed with some kind of purpose. Animal skulls, mostly small ones like squirrels and raccoons, arranged in patterns on rocks. bundles of dried flowers tied with what looked like hemp rope, candles, the cheap white kind you get at dollar stores, melted down to stubs, and pieces of paper weighted down with stones. I should have turned around right then. Every instinct I had was telling me to get away from that shelter, to hike on and find somewhere else to camp. But morbid curiosity got the better of me. I approached one of the paper offerings and picked it up. It was covered in handwritten text, the same strange symbols I had been seeing on the trail markers mixed in with actual words. The writing was rambling and disjointed. Something about the mountain's debt and the trail keeper and the price of passage. It read like the ravings of someone who was either extremely creative or extremely unwell, and I could not tell which. There were other papers too, and I read several of them. They all had the same general theme: references to ancient agreements, to sacrifices that must be made, to the importance of honoring the spirits of the mountain. One of them specifically mentioned the white blazes, calling them sacred markers that guide the worthy and mislead the unworthy. Another talked about how every person who walks the trail leaves something behind, whether they know it or not, and how that payment must be acknowledged and formalized. It was deeply unsettling stuff, made worse by the obvious sincerity in the writing. These were not jokes or pranks. Someone genuinely believed this stuff, or wanted others to think they did. I decided not to stay at the shelter. I hiked another 3 miles before making camp in a relatively flat spot well off the trail. I set up my tent in the fading light, made a cold dinner because I did not want to draw attention with a fire or even my camp stove, and tried to settle in for the night. But I could not shake the feeling of unease. Those offerings, those papers, the symbols on the trail markers. Something was happening in these woods that went beyond normal trail culture, and I had stumbled into the middle of it. I did not sleep well. Every sound seemed amplified and threatening. The rustling of leaves, the crack of branches, the calls of night birds. Around 2 a.m, I heard something that made my heart stop. Chanting, human voices, multiple people speaking or singing in unison. The sound was distant but clear, carried through the quiet forest on the still night air. I could not make out words, just the rhythm and cadence of it. Rising and falling, repetitive, almost hypnotic. It went on for maybe 20 minutes and then stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that felt even more oppressive than the chanting had been. I laid in my tent, barely breathing, my knife in one hand and my bear spray in the other. I waited for footsteps, for voices, for some indication that whoever had been chanting was coming my way, but nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I drifted into a fitful sleep just before dawn. The next morning, I packed up quickly and got back on the trail. I was hiking faster than usual, motivated partly by my planned mileage, but mostly by a strong desire to put distance between myself and whatever I had heard the night before. Around mid-morning, I passed another section with those strange symbols painted beneath the white blazes. This time, I noticed something else. The symbols were not random. They were appearing at specific intervals, almost like a countdown or progression. The designs were getting more complex, more elaborate, as I moved north along the trail. That afternoon, I reached another shelter. This one had no offerings around it, no strange papers or skulls. It looked completely normal. There were even a few other hikers there, taking a break and eating lunch. I felt a wave of relief at seeing other people. I joined them and casually asked if they had noticed anything weird on the trail lately. They looked at each other with these odd expressions, and one of them, a guy named Alara, asked me what I meant by weird. I described the symbols, the offerings at the shelter I had avoided, the chanting I had heard. They all went quiet. Then Alara said they had seen the symbols too, but they had been avoiding talking about it because they did not want to freak each other out. One of the other hikers, a woman in her 30s, said she had heard the chanting as well 2 nights ago. She had been staying at a different shelter and had seen figures in the woods near the shelter, moving through the trees with what looked like flashlights or lanterns. but she had not gotten a good look at them, and by morning, they were gone. We decided to hike together for the rest of the day, safety in numbers and all that. As a group of 4, we felt more secure, but as the day wore on and we continued north, the symbols kept appearing, and the offerings got more frequent. We started seeing them, not just at shelters, but at random points along the trail. Cairns of stones with candles on top, trees with cloth tied around them, the fabric covered in those same strange symbols, and once, disturbingly, what looked like a freshly killed rabbit hanging from a low branch, arranged in a way that was clearly ritualistic. That evening, we made camp early, choosing a spot well off the trail where we would be less visible. We built a small fire for cooking, but agreed to put it out completely before dark. Nobody wanted to be visible from the trail if those cultists, or whoever they were, came through at night. As the sun set and we sat in the darkness of our tents, we heard it again. The chanting. This time it was much closer, maybe within a few hundred yards of our position, and we could see lights through the trees. Not flashlights, but the flickering glow of torches or lanterns, moving along what must have been the trail. Alara pulled out his phone and started filming through the mesh of his tent. I did the same, trying to capture whatever we were witnessing. Through the trees in the darkness, we could see figures. Multiple people, maybe 8 or 10 of them, walking in a line. They were wearing robes or cloaks, dark-colored and hooded. They moved slowly and deliberately, continuing that rhythmic chanting. Some of them were carrying torches, others seemed to be carrying objects that I could not identify. They passed by our position, following the trail north, and gradually the light and sound faded into the distance. We did not move until dawn. We did not speak, did not make any noise at all. When the sun finally came up, we packed our gear in record time and got back on the trail. We hiked 22 miles that day, the longest day any of us had done, driven by sheer determination to get out of that section of forest. When we finally reached a trail town late that afternoon, we went straight to the ranger station. The ranger we spoke to listened to our story with an expression that was hard to read. Not disbelief exactly, but something like resignation. He said we were not the first people to report strange activity in that area. There was apparently a local legend about a group that called themselves the Trail Keepers. People who believed that the Appalachian Trail was built on sacred ground and that proper rituals needed to be performed to appease mountain spirits. The ranger said they were mostly harmless, that they did their ceremonies and left offerings, but never bothered hikers directly. I asked him about the chanting we had heard, the robed figures we had seen. He admitted that he did not know exactly who those people were or what they were doing. He said Forest Service and local police had tried to investigate a few times, but the group was elusive and seemed to operate on no set schedule. He assured us that there had never been any reports of hikers being threatened or harmed, but he also recommended that we report anything else we saw or heard. I showed him the video I had taken on my phone, but when I pulled up the file and hit play, the screen was just static. Digital noise with no image at all. I tried the photos I had taken of the symbols. Same thing, corrupted files that would not display. Every single image and video from those 2 days was unusable, but I have one clear frame that somehow survived. Just one, and it shows one of the robed figures standing perfectly still, facing away from the camera. Except the hood of the robe is turned slightly, just enough that you can see the side of the face, and it is looking directly at the camera, directly at me. So I am thankful they were not interested in me, or maybe they already got what they came for. I am thankful I was with other people who witnessed it too, because without that, I would question my own sanity. And I am thankful that whatever the trail keepers are doing out there in the Vermont woods, they let us pass without interference. Some trails have more than just hikers walking them. Some have guardians, or wardens, or cultists who believe they are keeping ancient bargains alive. And when you walk through their territory, you are part of their ritual whether you know it or not. The price of passage might already be paid in ways we cannot see. And that thought keeps me awake some nights, wondering what I left behind in those mountains and whether something followed me home. So, this happened in April of 2016. I was hiking through the Virginia section of the Appalachian Trail, which is one of the longest continuous stretches of the entire trail. Virginia goes on forever when you are hiking through it, over 500 miles of trail, and by the time this incident happened, I was maybe 2 weeks into my section hike. I was feeling strong, my body had adjusted to the daily grind of hiking, and I was in that perfect rhythm where the miles just click by and you feel like you could walk forever. The weather had been cooperative, mostly sunny with occasional rain that never lasted more than a few hours. I was making great time and feeling really good about my decision to take a month off work to do this extended section. Now, I had planned to reach a particular shelter that evening, one that my guidebook described as being in decent condition with a reliable water source nearby. I arrived at the shelter around 5 in the afternoon, which gave me plenty of time to set up, cook dinner, and relax before dark. But as soon as I entered the clearing where the shelter was located, I knew something was wrong. The area just felt off. There was trash scattered around, which is unfortunately not uncommon, but still disappointing. But it was more than that. There was gear strewn about, a backpack torn open with contents spilling out, a sleeping bag that looked like it had been shredded, and what appeared to be dried blood on the wooden floor of the shelter itself. My first instinct was to leave immediately. Whatever had happened here, I did not want any part of it. But I also knew that the next shelter was at least 8 miles away, and hiking that distance in the fading light through unfamiliar terrain was risky. I stood there, debating my options, my hand on my bear spray, when I heard a sound. A moan, low and pained, coming from behind the shelter. Every horror movie instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but my human instinct, my empathy, made me move toward the sound. Someone was hurt. Someone needed help. I came around the back of the shelter slowly, calling out to let whoever was there know I was approaching. And that is when I saw him. There was a man, probably in his 30s, lying on the ground propped up against the back wall of the shelter. He was in bad shape. His face was bruised and swollen. There was dried blood all down the front of his shirt, and one of his legs was bent at an angle that made my stomach turn. He looked up at me with eyes that were glazed with pain and possibly shock, and he tried to speak, but his words came out garbled and unclear. I dropped my pack and went to him immediately. I pulled out my first aid kit and started assessing his injuries while trying to keep him calm. I asked him what happened, and at first he just kept saying he was attacked. He said his hiking partner had gone crazy, had turned on him for no reason, had beaten him and left him here to die. He said his name was Canyon, and that he needed help, needed a hospital, needed me to radio for rescue. His story was coming out in fragments, interrupted by groans of pain, but the gist of it was that he and his partner had gotten into some kind of violent altercation, and he had come out on the losing end. I used my satellite communicator to send an SOS with our location. The device confirmed that the message had been received and that help was on the way, but it would take time. We were miles from the nearest road access, and rescue would have to either hike in or possibly use a helicopter if one was available. I did what I could to make Canyon comfortable. I gave him water, covered him with my emergency blanket, tried to stabilize his leg as best I could with the limited supplies I had. And all the while, he kept talking. He told me his hiking partner's name was Ridge, that they had been friends for years, that they had hiked sections of the trail together multiple times before. But something had changed on this trip. Canyon said Ridge had been acting strange for days, paranoid and aggressive, talking about how someone was following them, how they needed to protect themselves. Canyon thought maybe it was dehydration or some kind of heat exhaustion making Ridge irrational. But then the night before, Ridge had just snapped, had accused Canyon of stealing from him, of being in league with whoever was supposedly following them. And then Ridge had attacked him with his trekking poles, beating him until Canyon could not fight back anymore. The story was disturbing, but it made a kind of sense. Trail madness is a real thing. People get out here, isolated and exhausted, and sometimes their minds just break. Paranoia, hallucinations, violent outbursts. It happens. I asked Canyon where Ridge was now, whether he had left or was still in the area. Canyon's face went pale, and he said he did not know. Said Ridge had walked off into the woods after the attack and had not come back. That had been hours ago, maybe early morning. Canyon had been lying here all day, unable to move, hoping someone would come along. I should have seen the inconsistencies in his story right then. Should have questioned why there was so much blood in the shelter if Canyon had been attacked behind it. Should have wondered why his injuries, while serious, did not seem consistent with the level of violence he was describing. Should have asked more questions. But I was focused on keeping him alive and comfortable until rescue arrived, and I missed all the warning signs. As it started getting dark, I set up my headlamp and positioned it to illuminate the area where Canyon was lying. I sat nearby, monitoring his condition, making sure he stayed conscious and coherent. He kept talking, almost compulsively, repeating his story over and over with slight variations each time. Ridge had been his best friend. Ridge had betrayed him. Ridge was dangerous and might come back. I needed to be careful. We needed to be ready in case Ridge returned. Around 8 o'clock, I heard something in the woods. Footsteps, definitely human, coming from the direction of the trail. I stood up, my hand going to my bear spray, calling out to identify myself and warn whoever it was that I had an injured person and had called for rescue. The footsteps stopped, and then a voice called back, asking if anyone had seen his hiking partner, Canyon. The voice said his name was Ridge, and he was looking for his friend, who had wandered off that morning and not come back. I felt Canyon tense up beside me. He grabbed my arm with surprising strength and whispered urgently that I should not trust Ridge, that Ridge was the one who attacked him, that Ridge was dangerous. But something about the voice in the woods sounded genuinely worried, genuinely confused. I made a decision that probably saved my life. I called out to Ridge and told him to stay where he was, that I had bear spray and would use it if he came any closer, and that rescue was on the way and we would sort everything out then. Ridge agreed immediately. He said he understood, said he would wait on the trail, said he just wanted to make sure Canyon was okay. His voice did not sound threatening or aggressive. It sounded exhausted and scared, and that is when I started really looking at the scene around me, at the blood in the shelter, at the torn gear, at Canyon's injuries, which, while painful looking, were not life-threatening, at the way Canyon kept changing small details in his story every time he told it. I moved slightly away from Canyon, trying to be subtle about it, and pulled out my phone. Even without signal, I could use the flashlight. I shined it more carefully over the torn backpack and gear in the shelter, and I noticed something I had missed before. There was a wallet lying in the scattered items, and from where I was now standing, I could see the ID visible through the clear plastic window. The name on the ID was Ridge Martinez. This was Ridge's gear that had been destroyed, Ridge's belongings that had been torn apart. Canyon saw me looking, and his whole demeanor changed. The pained, helpless victim act dropped away, and his face twisted into something ugly. He started talking fast and aggressive, saying that Ridge had it coming, that Ridge was weak, that everything in Ridge's pack was now his by right of conquest. He said they had been arguing about a drug deal that went bad back home, that Ridge owed him money, that this had been building for months. The story about Ridge going crazy was complete fiction. Canyon had lured Ridge to this remote shelter and had attacked him, had beaten him, and robbed him, and left him for dead. Except Canyon had messed up. Ridge had not died. Ridge had managed to get away, injured and terrified, and had been hiding in the woods, trying to figure out what to do. And when Ridge heard my voice, heard me calling for help, he had hoped that maybe I could help him. But Canyon had gotten to me first, had fed me his victim story, and now I was between them with no idea who to trust. I backed away from Canyon, my bear spray now pointed at him instead of toward the woods. I called out to Ridge and asked him to describe what happened. His version was completely different, but made so much more sense. He said Canyon had been acting paranoid for days, talking about money Ridge supposedly owed him, getting increasingly aggressive. That morning, Canyon had attacked him while he was filtering water, had beaten him with rocks and tried to bury him, but Ridge had fought back and escaped into the forest. He had been afraid to approach the shelter because he thought Canyon might still be there. But he had heard me arrive and had been working up the courage to ask for help. Ridge asked if I could see a backpack, his backpack, in the shelter. Described what was in it to prove it was his, and every detail he gave me matched what I was seeing in the scattered gear. Canyon just sat there, his face flushed with rage, yelling that Ridge was lying, that I needed to believe him. But I could see it now. Canyon's injuries were real, but they were defensive wounds. Marks from Ridge fighting back. The bent leg was from when Ridge had probably kicked him trying to escape. When the rescue team finally arrived around 11 that night, I gave them the full story, both versions, and I showed them the evidence, the gear with Ridge's identification, the blood trail that led from the shelter into the woods, matching Ridge's story about escaping. And most damning, when they searched Canyon's belongings, they found Ridge's wallet, phone, and other personal items stashed in Canyon's pack. Ridge emerged from the woods where he had been waiting, and the rescue team took him to get medical attention immediately. He was in bad shape, with a concussion and several broken ribs, but he was alive. Canyon was placed in custody, restrained, and evacuated separately. The rangers told me later that when they searched more thoroughly around the shelter at daylight, they found evidence that Canyon had tried to dig a shallow grave. He had fully intended to murder Ridge and bury him in those woods, and if Ridge had been just a little weaker, a little slower to fight back, that is exactly what would have happened. The truly terrifying part came a few weeks later when I was back home. The rangers contacted me to let me know that they had found more than just evidence of assault. There was another body, buried about a quarter mile from that shelter, maybe 3 years old based on the decomposition. Another hiker that Canyon had apparently killed on a previous trip. A man who had been reported missing in 2013, last seen heading into that section of trail. Canyon had done this before, had found isolated victims, had killed and robbed them, and had gotten away with it because the trail is long and remote, and sometimes people just disappear. I testified at Canyon's trial, watched him get sentenced to life in prison for 2 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. And I think about how close Ridge came to being the 3rd victim. How if I had been just a little more trusting, a little less observant, I might have helped Canyon finish what he started. I had spent 3 hours keeping a murderer comfortable, giving him water, making sure he stayed alive. The man who would have killed me without hesitation if Ridge had not survived to tell the truth. So I am thankful I did not become another burial site for that monster's crimes. I am thankful Ridge was strong enough and smart enough to survive. I am thankful I saw that ID when I did. And I am thankful that Canyon is locked away, where he can never hurt another hiker again. The trail is supposed to be a place of beauty and peace, where strangers become trail family and everyone looks out for each other. But predators know that too. They know we are trusting and helpful and isolated. They know we are vulnerable. And some of them walk among us, wearing the same gear, speaking the same language, looking exactly like every other hiker until the moment they reveal what they really are. So trust your instincts, question stories that do not add up, and remember that not everyone on the trail is there for the same reasons you are. So this happened in March of 2023. I had been planning this particular section hike for months, specifically because I wanted to experience something that most hikers talk about but few actually witness: the Brown Mountain Lights. Now, for those who do not know, Brown Mountain is in North Carolina, and the lights are this famous unexplained phenomenon that has been documented for over a century. Scientists have tried to explain them as car headlights reflecting off atmospheric conditions or swamp gas, or any number of natural causes. But locals and witnesses insist the lights are something else entirely, something that cannot be explained by conventional science. I am a pretty skeptical person by nature. I work in engineering, I believe in data and evidence, and I generally think that most mysteries have rational explanations once you dig deep enough. But I have always been fascinated by unsolved phenomena, and the Brown Mountain lights seem like the perfect combination of accessible and genuinely weird. The Appalachian Trail runs relatively close to Brown Mountain, and I had timed my hike to coincide with a new moon, when visibility would be best for seeing the lights if they appeared. I was not expecting anything supernatural. I just thought it would be cool to see a natural phenomenon that science had not fully explained yet. Now, I reached my planned campsite around 4 in the afternoon on the second day of my hike. The spot was about 2 miles from Brown Mountain itself, with a clear view across the valley toward the mountain ridge. Perfect positioning for light watching. I set up my tent, prepared my dinner, and settled in to wait for darkness. The weather was clear and cool, ideal conditions. As the sun set and true darkness fell, I positioned myself on a rock outcropping with my camera ready, hoping to capture footage if the lights appeared. Around 8:30, I saw the first one, a glowing orb, maybe the size of a basketball from my perspective, hovering above the ridgeline of Brown Mountain. It had this pale yellowish color, almost like candlelight, and it moved slowly from left to right before winking out. I felt a rush of excitement. I'd actually seen one. I grabbed my camera and started recording, waiting for another to appear. And it did. Then another. Within 15 minutes, there were maybe 5 or 6 of them visible at once, appearing and disappearing, moving in what seemed like random patterns across the mountainside. I was completely absorbed in watching and filming them. It was beautiful in a strange, ethereal way. The lights seemed to pulse slightly as they moved, growing brighter and then dimmer, in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. I must have watched them for over an hour, and in that time I started to notice something odd. The lights seemed to be getting closer, not quickly, just gradually drifting down from the mountain ridge and across the valley toward my position. At first, I thought it was just a trick of perspective, my eyes adjusting to the darkness and making distance judgments difficult. But the lights kept coming closer, and eventually there was no mistaking it. They were moving toward me deliberately. By 9:30, the nearest lights were maybe 100 yards away, hovering at about tree height. And that is when I started to feel genuinely unsettled. The lights were not just glowing orbs anymore. Up close, I could see that they seemed to have depth, like I was looking into them rather than at them, and they were responding to my movements. When I shifted position on my rock, the lights would pause or change direction slightly, as if they were aware of me. When I stood up, they moved closer. When I backed away, they advanced. I decided it was time to head back to my tent. The scientific curiosity that had brought me here was being rapidly replaced by a primal unease. These lights were not behaving like any natural phenomenon I had ever heard of. They were not random atmospheric reflections or gases. They were moving with purpose, with intelligence. I started walking back toward my campsite, trying to appear calm but keeping my eyes on the lights. And they followed me. Not aggressively, but steadily, maintaining roughly the same distance as I moved. When I reached my tent, I turned to look back at them. There were at least a dozen now, spread out in a loose semicircle, maybe 50 feet away from my campsite. They hovered there, pulsing gently, and I swear they felt like they were watching me. Not with eyes, because they did not have any features I could see, but with awareness. I could feel their attention on me like a physical pressure. I pulled out my phone to take another photo, to document how close they had come. In the moment my phone powered on, it died, just shut off completely. Battery indicator had shown 65% charge 5 minutes ago when I last checked. but now it was totally dead. Would not respond to the power button at all. That scared me more than the lights themselves. I grabbed my flashlight from my pack, thinking I would use the bright beam to scare them away, or at least make them keep their distance. But when I clicked it on and aimed it at the nearest light, my flashlight died too. Brand new batteries, fully charged, and it just went dark. I tried my headlamp next. Same result. The LED came on for maybe 2 seconds, and then flickered out. I was standing there in the darkness with a dozen glowing orbs surrounding my campsite, and no working light source. I do not know how long I stood there frozen. It felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. The lights just hovered, pulsing, waiting, and then one of them moved closer. It drifted toward me slowly, coming within maybe 10 feet, and I could feel heat radiating from it. Not burning heat, but warmth, like standing near a fire. And I felt something else too. A pull. Like the light was tugging at something inside me, calling to me, inviting me to come closer. Part of my brain was screaming at me to run, to get away. But another part, a part that felt like it was not entirely my own thoughts, was telling me to step toward the light, to reach out and touch it, to let it take me somewhere. I actually took a step toward it. My foot moved without me consciously deciding to move it. And that is what broke the spell. The realization that I was not fully in control of my own actions shocked me back to awareness, and I stumbled backward, nearly falling over my tent. I shouted something. I do not even remember what. Just a wordless yell of fear and defiance, and the lights retreated. They pulled back about 20 feet, hovering at the edge of my campsite clearing. But they did not leave. I knew I could not stay there. Whatever these things were, they were affecting my mind, making me want to go with them. I needed to get away from them before I lost the ability to resist. I started grabbing my essential gear, stuffing my sleeping bag into my pack, pulling up my tent stakes. The lights watched, but did not interfere. I got my pack on, took a bearing on my compass by feel in the darkness, and started hiking. Not on the trail, just straight away from the lights in what I hoped was the direction of the nearest road access. The lights followed. For the first hour of my nighttime panic hike through the forest, they stayed with me, floating along behind and beside me, maintaining their distance but never letting me get away. I stumbled over roots and rocks, pushed through undergrowth, scraped my face on branches I could not see in the darkness. But I kept moving. I had to. Every time I slowed down or paused to catch my breath, I felt that pull again. That urge to turn around and walk back to the lights, to let them lead me wherever they wanted to go. I do not know when they stopped following me. At some point, I looked back and realized I could not see them anymore. I kept hiking anyway, driven by fear and adrenaline, until the first gray light of dawn started filtering through the trees. When I could finally see where I was going, I stopped and looked around. I had no idea where I was. I pulled out my compass and my map, and based on my heading and the time I had been walking, I estimated I was about 5 miles from where I had camped. 5 miles of forest that I had covered in the dark, by feel, without a trail. I should not have been able to do that without seriously injuring myself. But aside from some scratches and bruises, I was okay. I hiked toward where my map indicated the nearest road should be, and I reached it around 8 in the morning. I flagged down the first vehicle I saw, a local in a pickup truck, and asked for a ride to the nearest town. The driver took one look at me, scratched up and wild-eyed, and agreed immediately. On the ride, I asked him about the Brown Mountain lights. Had he ever seen them? He said, yeah, lots of times. Everyone around here had seen them at some point. I asked if he knew anyone who had gotten close to them. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, yeah, he knew people who had gotten close, but some of those people were not quite right afterward, had gaps in their memory, lost time they could not account for. Some of them were never seen again. He dropped me off at a diner in town, and I sat there for hours, drinking coffee and trying to process what had happened. I eventually called a friend to come pick me up and drive me back to where I had parked my car. I did not go back for my campsite. I left my tent and whatever gear I had not grabbed in my panic packing. I just wanted to get home and away from those mountains. When I finally got home and plugged in my phone, it powered on immediately. Worked perfectly fine. No issues at all. Same with my flashlight and headlamp. Fresh batteries, full charge, everything working exactly as it should. But when I checked the photos and videos I had taken of the lights, they were all corrupted. Digital noise and artifacts, nothing usable, except for one single frame that somehow survived. It shows a glowing orb against the darkness, and in the reflection of the camera lens, you can see me. But I'm not standing where I was when I took the photo. In the reflection, I am maybe 20 feet farther away than I actually was. Like the image captured where I was going to be, not where I was. I also noticed something else when I got home. I checked the timestamps on my gear, my watch, my phone, and I am missing 6 hours. I remember the lights appearing around 8:30. I remember hiking away from them sometime after 9:30, but according to every device I have, I did not reach the road until 8 a.m. That is nearly 11 hours total, but I only have clear memories of maybe 5 hours of that time. There are 6 hours somewhere in that night that I cannot account for. 6 hours where I do not know what I was doing or where I was. So I am thankful I woke up when I did, because I do not think those lights planned on letting me go. I'm thankful I fought against that pull, that compulsion to walk toward them, and I am thankful that I made it to that road at dawn, even if I cannot remember the full journey. But those missing hours haunt me. What happened during that time? Where was I? What did the lights do to me while I was under their influence? I do not have answers. I do not think I want answers. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some lights are better left unwatched. The brown mountain lights are still out there, still appearing on clear nights, still calling to anyone curious enough or foolish enough to seek them out. But I will never go back. Whatever those things are, wherever they wanted to take me, I escaped once. I do not think I would be lucky enough to escape a second time. So this happened in November of 2019. I was attempting a late-season section hike through New Hampshire, which I knew was pushing it in terms of weather and safety. November in the White Mountains is no joke. You can get snow, freezing rain, dangerous wind conditions, and temperatures that drop below zero at night. Most sensible hikers are off the trail by this point, waiting for spring to resume their journeys. But I was not in a sensible place mentally. I had just gone through a really difficult breakup, lost my job due to company downsizing, and I was feeling like my entire life was falling apart. I needed to do something hard, something that would force me to focus on survival rather than my problems. So I planned this late-season push, knowing it would be challenging but believing I could handle it. Now, the forecast had been calling for a major storm system to move through the area, but I thought I could get ahead of it. I was wrong. On the third day of my hike, the storm hit harder and faster than predicted. What was supposed to be light snow turned into a full blizzard by early afternoon. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, the wind was howling, and the temperature plummeted. I was trying to push through to a shelter that was supposedly another 6 miles ahead, but the conditions were deteriorating so rapidly that I knew I might not make it. Hypothermia was a real possibility, and my fingers were already going numb despite my gloves. That is when I saw him through the swirling snow. A figure standing just off the trail waving at me. As I got closer, I could see it was a man, probably in his 50s, wearing what looked like fairly standard cold weather hiking gear. He had to shout over the wind to be heard, but he was offering me shelter. He said his house was just a quarter mile off the trail, that he lived out here year-round, and often helped hikers when storms came through. He said his name was Mesa, and that he considered it his duty to provide aid to travelers in need. He called himself a trail angel, using the term that hikers use for people who help them along their journey. I was freezing, exhausted, and scared, The offer of a warm house instead of another 6 miles of brutal hiking through a blizzard sounded like salvation. I followed him off the trail, and true to his word, within about 15 minutes, we reached a small cabin tucked back in the woods. It was well maintained, with smoke coming from the chimney and warm light glowing in the windows. It looked perfect. Mesa opened the door and ushered me inside, and the wave of heat that hit me when I entered felt absolutely incredible after hours in the freezing wind. The interior of the cabin was cozy in that rustic mountain way. Wood stove burning hot, comfortable furniture, a small kitchen area, and what looked like a couple of bedrooms off the main room. Mesa immediately started fussing over me, helping me out of my wet outer layers, getting me positioned near the stove to warm up. He put a kettle on for tea and started preparing what he said would be a hot meal. He was chatty and friendly, telling me stories about other hikers he had helped over the years, talking about his life living out here in isolation. He seemed like the stereotypical trail angel, the kind of generous soul who loves the trail community and wants to give back. But as I started to warm up and my brain began functioning normally again, I started noticing things that did not quite add up. For one thing, Mesa kept the front door locked. He had locked it immediately after we came inside, turning a deadbolt and pocketing the key. When I asked about it, he said it was to keep the heat in and the wind out, which made sense, but also felt slightly off. And he was watching me constantly, not in a friendly, concerned way, but in a way that felt almost proprietary, like he was assessing me, evaluating me for something. The cabin also felt strange the more I looked at it. There were newspaper clippings tacked to one wall, and when I got close enough to read them, I realized they were all about missing hikers. Articles about people who had disappeared on the Appalachian Trail over the past several years. Some I recognized from online forums and hiking community discussions. Others were names I had never heard, but there were dozens of them, carefully cut out and arranged on the wall like some kind of display. When I asked Mesa about them, his expression changed. The friendly, welcoming demeanor slipped for just a moment, and I saw something cold and calculating underneath. He said he kept track of missing hikers because it was important to remember them, to honor their memory. He said the mountains were dangerous and claimed too many lives, and he felt it was his responsibility to document those losses. But the way he said it, the way he looked at those clippings, it did not feel like remembrance. It felt like something else. Something wrong. I started to feel uneasy, that instinctive sense that I was in danger even though I could not quite articulate why. I told Mesa that I was feeling better and should probably try to get back on the trail, that I wanted to make it to the shelter before dark. He immediately became agitated. He said I could not leave, that it was not safe, that the storm was too severe. He said I needed to stay until spring, that it was too dangerous to be on the trail in winter conditions. The way he said it, the intensity in his voice, made it clear this was not a suggestion. It was a demand. I tried to play it cool, said I would just rest for a few more minutes and then reassess. But Mesa was not having it. He moved between me and the door, physically blocking my exit. He started talking faster, his words becoming more erratic. He said he had been alone for so long that hikers kept leaving him, that he just wanted someone to stay. He said he could keep me safe, could keep me warm and fed, that I did not need to go back out there into the cold and danger. He said he was saving me, protecting me from the mountain that wanted to kill me. That is when I realized the tea he had given me was doing something to me. My vision was starting to blur slightly, my thoughts becoming fuzzy and slow. He had drugged me. This was not just an overly friendly trail angel with boundary issues. This was someone who had done this before, who had a system worked out. Get hikers off the trail during storms, bring them back to his cabin, drug them, and then what? I thought about those newspaper clippings, all those missing hikers. Were they really lost in the mountains? Or had some of them made the same mistake I had? Had they followed a friendly stranger offering shelter and never been seen again? The drug was affecting me fast, whatever it was. I could feel my body getting heavy, my reactions slowing down, but I also felt fear spiking through me, adrenaline fighting against the sedative in my system. I knew if I passed out here, I might never wake up. Or if I did wake up, it would be as Mesa's prisoner. I thought about the way he had said I needed to stay until spring. Not should stay, not it would be safer to stay. Needed to stay. He had been planning to keep me here, trapped, for months. I forced myself to stand up, using the arm of the chair for support. Mesa immediately started talking, his voice taking on a soothing, almost hypnotic quality. He was telling me to sit down, to relax, that everything was going to be fine, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was debating whether to physically restrain me or to let the drugs do their work. I stumbled toward the door, and he moved to block me again. That is when I made my move. I grabbed the hot kettle that was still sitting on the stove and swung it at him. The water was not boiling anymore, but it was still hot enough to make him scream and jump back. I used those few seconds to lunge for the door, fumbling with the deadbolt. My hands were not working right, the drugs making my coordination terrible, but panic gave me focus. I got the bolt open and threw myself out into the blizzard. The cold hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment, I could not remember which direction the trail was. But I could hear Mesa behind me yelling, and that fear drove me forward. I ran through the snow, my lungs burning with the cold air, fighting against the drowsiness that was trying to pull me down. I had no idea if I was going the right direction. I just knew I had to get away from that cabin and from Mesa. I do not know how long I wandered through that storm. The drugs and the cold were working together to shut my body down. I fell multiple times, got back up, kept moving because stopping meant dying. At some point, I must have made it back to the trail or close to it, because when I finally collapsed, I collapsed onto something relatively flat and clear. And that is where a couple of snowmobilers found me the next morning. They were part of a search and rescue team that had been mobilized when the storm cleared enough to allow operations. I woke up in a hospital with severe hypothermia and frostbite on 3 of my fingers. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive. I told the police everything that had happened, about Mesa and his cabin and the newspaper clippings and the drug tea. They mounted an investigation, went into the woods looking for the cabin I had described, and they found it. About a quarter mile off the trail, exactly where I said it would be. Mesa was there, and they arrested him on the spot. When they searched the cabin more thoroughly, they found evidence that made my blood run cold, even in the warm hospital bed. There was a basement, a room below the main floor that had been prepared as a cell, mattress on the floor, chains attached to the wall, a bucket in the corner. There was also food stored down there, enough to keep someone alive for months. And journals. Mesa had been keeping journals documenting his obsession with the trail and with hikers. He wrote about wanting to keep people safe, about how the mountains were too dangerous, about how he needed to protect hikers from themselves, even if they did not understand. The police never found definitive evidence that he had actually held anyone captive before me, though several of the missing hiker cases I had seen on his wall were being reinvestigated. What they did find was enough to charge him with attempted kidnapping, assault, and drugging. His lawyers tried to argue that he was mentally ill, that he genuinely believed he was saving people. And maybe he did believe that. Maybe in his twisted mind, he was a guardian angel keeping hikers safe by imprisoning them in his basement. But that does not make it any less terrifying. I spent a week in the hospital recovering, lost the tips of 2 fingers to frostbite, a permanent reminder of that night. I also lost something less tangible, that trust in trail angels, in the kindness of strangers, in the fundamental goodness of the hiking community. Because Mesa had been a part of that community for years. He had helped people, had a reputation as someone who looked out for hikers, and he had used that reputation to identify vulnerable targets. So I am thankful I chose frostbite over whatever that psycho had planned for me in that basement. I am thankful the drugs did not knock me out before I could escape. I am thankful for the search and rescue team that found me before. The cold finished what Mesa had started. And I am thankful that my instincts, even dulled by drugs and cold and exhaustion, were strong enough to recognize danger and fight back. The trail has real angels on it, people who help because they genuinely care. But it also has predators who wear the same disguise, who use our trust and our need against us. And sometimes the difference between the two is not clear until it is almost too late. I was one of the lucky ones. I made it out. But I think about those newspaper clippings on Mesa's wall, all those names, and I wonder how many of them were not so lucky.